Great. Okay, hello to the four of you. Thank you so much for coming. I feel like talks like this, whenever it's very small, are always awkward because you feel like you have to stay here. I will not be offended if anybody has to leave halfway through. Um, no hard feelings at all, and I'm sure more people will come in. I think I was able to get it up. So, my name is Cortland, and this talk is, but it was published, right? Understanding and Combating Bias in Academic Research. This is me. I have no disclosures. I wish that I had some, but I don't. Maybe 10 years from now. Here are the learning objectives, but what I really want you to get from this talk is to be able to really take a JEDI, so justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion focus from your research, and that's from the start of your research. Whenever you're thinking about a research question, to whenever you're coming up with your design, to whenever you're actually collecting the data, to whenever you're submitting it and writing it up. This picture has 2 points. So number one, I think it's a really pretty picture and I wanted to use it to draw everybody's attention in. And then number two, it helps me introduce the first thing that I want everybody to do, and that's a landscape assessment. So anytime you're starting a new research project, I want you to do a landscape assessment. What actually is that? So there's a few different parts, and you'll basically go through and you'll ask yourself these questions. Who? So who's affected by the topic that you want to study? How are they affected? Is it positive or negative? Sorry, I'm going to see if I can move this so I'm not just stuck behind here. Close enough. If I trip over these cords, thankfully we have enough ER doctors in here, so I feel like I'll be safe. The next is what? What was the effect that what you plan on studying had on these individuals? Again, was it negative? Was it positive? The last is when. When were they affected? Is this something that happened long time in the past? Is it something that happened more recently, about 5 years ago? Are they still being affected? Where? Were individuals from a particular group universally affected, or was it more isolated? And then why? Why were the groups affected? So what are the historical and cultural antecedents that affected the community? And there's so many different ways to do this landscape assessment, but it really all boils down to having a conversation. So chatting with individuals. You can do focus groups, interviews, community meetings. And I want to take a quick dive into health equity research because there's a few important considerations here. So prior to all of the recent executive orders, there was this gold rush mentality of individuals entering health equity research. And that brought us this term of health equity tourism, which is the practice of investigators without prior experience or commitment to health equity research really parachuting into the field. So it gives a great visual in response to timely and often temporary increases in public interest and resources. There's a few different consequences of health equity tourism, and the first really is the colonization and gentrification of the research space. And what this does is it basically dilutes the research space. So I do want to caveat this that it's great to have new perspectives and that a lot of the top health equity researchers are not from minority or marginalized backgrounds, but it's just something to be important of. So when a lot of these new scholars are coming in, they're erasing the scholars that laid a lot of the foundational knowledge. And those scholars are generally from minority or marginalized backgrounds. And this quote from Dr. Gibbons really speaks to this. So they say, "For so long, it was hard to get any attention to this field. Now we're competing with people who don't have the depth, but have far more resources. You start to wonder if you can still live here." And there's a few very obvious examples of this, but one was, it occurred about 5 years ago, where one of our major medical journals, I'm not going to name names, they published a special edition on healthcare disparities and racism, basically to highlight how they felt that it was very important. They had 5 articles. Guess how many of them had a Black lead or corresponding author? Spoiler alert, it was 0. Only 1 had a Hispanic corresponding author. So, that really shows this health equity tourism. And then of the 5 articles, 1 that had all white authors published data that actually had been published, really similar data, about 3 years before by all Black authors in a lesser known research article. So we just talked about some of the consequences of health equity tourism, colonization and gentrification of the research space, There's also this dilution of research output. So oftentimes whenever individuals are entering the field of health equity research and they don't really have the formal training, they're not comfortable talking about the issues, not comfortable saying the words racism, sexism, homophobia. And so they kind of skirt around them, and it really dilutes the message. It's also just there's very specialized techniques and knowledge that you have to do health equity research. And so if you don't have those, it leads to bad research output, which we know leads to bad public policy and bad medicine. So how do you transition from this health equity tourist to really a community member? So the individual that coined the term health equity tourism gives a few recommendations. Principle number 1, equity is fundamental. So equity must remain the core goal of all scientific inquiry. So your endpoint can be to help reduce healthcare disparities, but throughout every single aspect of your research, you have to make sure that you're continuously analyzing your research to see that it doesn't disproportionately impact individuals from certain backgrounds. So for example, what about individuals that have difficulty with reading? How are they going to do your consent process? So a good way to keep equity fundamental is to return to those landscape questions that we talked about at the beginning and just keep asking yourself them. Second principle, sustainability and urgency. With health equity tourism, there's often this focus on very quick fixes. We're in emergency medicine, we love quick fixes. These quick fixes, however, often rely on deficit-based science, which says that these marginalized and minoritized communities don't have the power to do their own liberation. They really require other external forces. In addition, we know research generally rewards productivity over transformation. This does not work with health equity research because it requires a long time commitment. First, you have to build trust with the communities, and then you have to create actual public policy change. Third is collaboration. So just like hospital teams, it's important to have intra and interdisciplinary members on your research team. And this introduces the term of citizen science, which is basically where members of the public, so just general members of the community, are a part of your research team beyond just being a participant. And this brings us to the next topic of who should be on your research team. And now I'm just going to take a step back from focusing on health equity research and talk just about research in general. So when picking members of your research team, there's a few things to consider, and one of them is that you don't want to contribute to the minority tax. There's also the majority subsidy, but that's kind of a separate entity. So the minority tax in its most basis is whenever minority individuals, often faculty members, so I'm a female faculty member, I'm biracial, so I'm a minority faculty member, we get tasked to do certain things that don't come with the credit and the reward that more standard options and more standard roles in research would. And it's kind of all in the name of diversity. So you could be asked to do a peer review, you could be asked to read an article without being offered authorship or welcome onto the research team. There's several potential minority tax reform strategies, but I just want to talk about two here. So the first is tax deduction. And this basically just takes that all of the work that somebody would previously be doing that would be called the minority tax, and you contribute it to promotion or raise. You basically incentivize and actually put value and quantity to this work in terms of their career growth. And then the next is tax refund. So that's kind of what it sounds like. For everything that somebody is doing that could be classified as a minority tax, you can actually pay them for their efforts in grant and administrative support. Another thing to consider is tokenism. So how this plays out in research is we generally invite, one single minority faculty member to the team to lend credibility, and we feel all good about ourselves. But that person's not actually given any decision-making tools, so in other words, they're not being invited to have a full seat at the table. So now we have our research team, and we're going to go into a little bit about the design of the research. So that brings us back to the landscape assessment. So in addition to these questions that we talked about before, there's a few other questions that you want to ask yourself. The first is the community involved in the research design? We talked about that a little bit with the citizen science. How do community members desire to be approached? Does the community respect and trust the research design and the types of data that's collected? And how will the community get and understand the results? Now we're going to talk about how you can actually increase the diversity of your research participants. So there's so many studies that show that there's numerous factors that go into having diverse research participants, so your research subjects. So in the US, there was a study of over 3,000 individuals enrolled in cancer trials, and they found that Black and Hispanic patients had much lower phase 1 enrollment, and the odds ratios were 0.46 and 0.25 compared to their white majority counterparts. And then Asian patients had much higher enrollments with odds ratios of 1.38, and those withstood for many confounding factors. So there's a bunch of different ways that you can increase the diversity of your research participants. And the FDA actually released some clinical trial guidelines several years ago, so I'll go over those and then just add a few of my own. First is just broaden eligibility criteria. So when it comes to exclusion criteria, we really have this very paternalistic view. We want to protect individuals, so therefore we're excluding them. That doesn't make sense to me. We exclude individuals whose preferred language is in English. We exclude individuals who are prison. We exclude individuals who weren't born in the US. We exclude pregnant women. But are we actually doing them more harm by having these exclusion criteria? So let's take individuals that are in prison, for example. So before I go any further, I do want to acknowledge the atrocities that happened to many marginalized and minoritized communities, particularly prisoners as it relates to research. But as this quote says, exploitation doesn't need to be inevitable. Here's a study. They looked at 70 individuals in prison, and all of these individuals were participating in various research projects, and they basically asked them their perspectives. Here, they asked, I felt taken advantage of by being in this study, and the study exploited me. You can see nobody totally agreed or mostly agreed, and it's like 80% of people that totally disagreed. Then asking about desire for access. There should be more research studies for prisoners to join if they want to. Inmates should have the chance to join more research studies. Look all the way over here, totally agree, 70%. So are we actually doing more injustice by trying to protect these communities? The next thing to do is just acknowledge the past and have a particular focus on past abuses and exploitations. You want to emphasize patients' rights and state that consent really should be an ongoing conversation. Next is just to reduce logistical barriers, language and cultural barriers. So there's numerous studies that show that individuals with lower income are less likely to participate in research studies. So one examined around 1,500 patients, and they found that individuals with an annual household income of less than $50,000 were around 40% less likely to participate in research studies compared to individuals with higher income. So how can you actually make it easier for them? Some barriers that you can combat. So you can have virtual visits, weekend hours. You can offer childcare. You can offer transportation if your study requires visits. And then visit frequency should also be minimized as much as possible. What about reducing language and cultural barriers? So you should start just by having interpreters available. This is kind of obvious, but we don't generally do it. And I know a few very large studies that are like, well, we couldn't get interpreters, so we're therefore not including anybody that doesn't speak perfect English. Again, we're not doing those individuals justice. There's another tool. So the CDC here has this thing called Clear Communication Index, and I really love it. So basically what you do is you take anything of your research study, so you could take the consent form, for example, and you upload it here, and then it goes through and makes it more inclusive. It makes it easier to read. It can help you get it so that it's really there for everybody. Then you should also partner with community organizations and leaders so that you can understand those language, cultural, and community level factors that might influence how somebody would feel whenever they're participating in a study. And then lastly, ensure that your participation incentives and processes to obtain those incentives don't cause concern for some groups. So do you ask for social security numbers? Do you have very store-specific gift cards where this store somebody might not even be comfortable going into? Next, increasing site diversity. Just like having a doctor that looks similar to you has been shown to increase health outcomes, it's known that having a diverse research team or having a team with a PI that's from a marginalized or minority community will increase diversity of the participants. So how do you actually get more diverse researchers? One way, you can partner with the HBCU, Historically Black College and University. A lot of the HBCUs are in neighborhoods where there's a large percentage of what would be considered minority or marginalized individuals. And Really, one of the few things that in those studies that look at income and trial participation, one of the things that actually combated income was distance to the trial site. So if you're closer to the trial site, you're more likely to participate. So now we talked about the design of our study, and now we're in the data analysis phase. So the first thing that you want to do is make sure that you're disaggregating your data. That's basically just breaking it up into smaller categories. And there are so many different identity categories that you can break it up into, so you want to see what's important for your research. Then what I want you to do is actually re-aggregate it. But I want you to re-aggregate it with a focus on intersectional identities. And this is basically the concept that individuals have multiple identities and that it's that combination of their identities that display how they view themselves and how the world views them. So again, I'm a biracial woman. That is part of my intersectional identity. Then you want to make sure that you're tracking withdrawals, so analyzing and documenting reasons for participant dropout to identify patterns and potential biases. Now let's switch to writing your research. You want to make sure that you are very intentional in the semantics that you use. So oftentimes people will use race, ethnicity, sex, gender as a proxy for some inequalities such as housing, healthcare, nutrition, or education as sources of diseases. But rather than saying Black patients have a higher rate of asthma, which is actually inaccurate, you could say that patients who live in areas with higher levels of air pollution and lower quality housing have higher rates of asthma. Next, we'll talk a little bit about gender and sex. So I know anybody that has done research or written research, we know at least some of these guidelines. Every single journal that you submit to says, say that you conform to stroke guideline, consort guideline. But there's actually another guideline that is just as well researched and just as well backed, but we don't know it. And I honestly didn't know it before I did this talk. So that's the Sex and Gender Equity in Research Guidelines, or SAGR, I don't know how they pronounce it. But similar to consort and stroke, it basically goes through and helps you ensure that you're being inclusive whenever you're writing your manuscript. And some journals are actually starting to include this along with the other guidelines now. Next thing is just focusing on inclusive language. So you want to make sure that you're using people first language whenever possible. So this describes what a person has rather than saying what a person is. So rather than saying parolee, you could say individual on parole. Next, whenever you're talking about socioeconomic status, you want to be very, very specific in what you're actually considering there. And you shouldn't, unless you really need to use the term socioeconomic, I would recommend staying away from it and just say exactly what you're talking about. So income, education, parental education, occupation, or what other factors. When you're talking about mental health, you also want to make sure that you're very specific. And if you're talking about a specific disease, say that. So an individual with depression, rather than saying somebody with a mental health issue. And if they're not already diagnosed, then you could say somebody experiencing a mental health crisis. So now we're going to go and talk about another important thing whenever you're writing your research, and that's citation bias. Citation bias is citing or not citing a source for reasons other than its relevance and quality. So there's numerous ways that this can play out in research, and one is by something called the Matilda Effect. And I'm not very religious, but for unto everyone that house shall be given, and he shall have abundance, but from him that hath not shall be taken away, even that which he hath. I never thought I would stand up in a lecture and say that, so that was a very weird moment for me. But basically what this means is rich get rich, poor get poor. How does that translate to research? Famous scientists get more fame from their work. Already highly cited papers are more likely to be cited by new incoming papers. Richly funded scientists get more research funds. Again, rich get rich, poor get poor. This is just an example of how it can play out in popular media. So somebody that has 13 followers and publishes something that seems actually science-based versus somebody with 1,000 followers, and they're just going to keep getting more followers. So there's also the Matilda Effect. And this refers to the tendency for women to receive less citations of their work. there's been numerous studies that have shown this, and generally what's found is that around 30% difference. So women, whenever they're first authors or last authors, are less likely to be cited by 30% than when men are first or last authors. So how can you combat those? There's a few different ways. The first is on this citation diversity statement. So this is something that I put in my papers. Some journals are requiring it, others don't, but even if they don't require it, it can still be good to include. And it's basically a paragraph before your references where you acknowledge the bias in citations. And this is just general bias in citations kind of all together, but also in your publication. And then you show that you really thought intentionally about this in terms of increasing diversity of your citations. And so what you do is you actually generally look at the first and last author of all of your citations, and you can do it for whatever category you're thinking of. So that's the first thing. So what type of diversity should the statement address? Kind of some easy and obvious ones are gender and ethnicity. How do you actually tell the identity characteristics of the authors that you cite? So I said this earlier, I'm biracial. I'm half black, half white. But if you look at my picture, I guarantee you would not think that. So if you just look at pictures, it's not going to work. So one way that some people do it, and this has limitations just like everything in research does, is there's a few different websites where you can input somebody's first and last name, and it actually outputs the chance that they are male, female, Black, Hispanic, and obviously this negates a lot of the gender spectrum and has its own biases, but that's what a lot of these citation diversity statements are doing. And then also, how do you just determine what's a good benchmark for a good percent of diversity is? We want to say 50-50, but I don't know. There's not a right answer here. There is this tool, and you can use it for this diversity statement. You can also use it whenever you're writing your own research, just analyzing your own subjects. And it is the Clinical Study Diversity Score Project. And what you do, it's public access. You basically put in, these are all different categories, so ethnicity and race, age, household income, whatever you want. And then in the white background, you put your ideal study population. So if you're studying the US, you would put the demographics there. And then in the yellow, you put your data, so what your actual study participants are. And then it outputs this diversity score, which is pretty cool. You can say how you want to weigh different components, so you can weigh sex, ethnicity, race differently than age and household income. And so I just put in some terrible data here. Basically said that 70% of my participants were white compared to 57.3% of the US population. And my diversity score is, unsurprisingly, 16.8 because I didn't add in any of the other categories. But you can do that whenever you're writing your own research or whenever you're actually analyzing another study and seeing how well they incorporated it. Here are just some examples of diversity statements, citation diversity statements. And I don't expect anybody to read these, but on the last slide, there's a QR code that has the links to all of the important websites, as well as some of these. And then the last thing I want to just talk about is editorial boards and bias. So this is a study that looked at all of the major emergency medicine journals, and they looked at the editorial boards. And if you just focus on this bottom part, you can see it's male, female, and then each journal. In this top part, it's editorial member, then editor, and then editor-in-chief. And again, this negates the gender spectrum, so I do just want to acknowledge that. But you can see the majority of editorial members, editors, and editors-in-chief are men. That's not really surprising. Why does that actually matter? So this quote puts it really well. As gatekeepers of knowledge, they perform a key role in leading academic fields and have a strong influence on what's published and thus what informs communication, research, and teaching. And the research backs that up. So there's so many studies that show that journals with diverse editorial boards are more likely to publish diverse research articles, and that's in terms of topic diversity and then also diversity of authors. So whenever you're submitting your manuscript or if you're serving as an editor, this is something that's important to consider. Then just going over some key takeaways. So we talked about transitioning from a health equity tourist to a community member and the importance of centering equity in your efforts. We talked about ensuring that your efforts are sustainable and that they're not just that quick fix. Then we talked about collaborating, talked about designing inclusive research projects. So how do you remove barriers to participation? How do you make sure that all of your materials more inclusive? Talked about writing up your manuscript using precise inclusive language, and then diversity citations, references, and then the QR code. And I can take any questions. Thank you all so much.